Lifted his champagne flute, and the chandelier light caught the rim just so, scattering little white stars across the linen tablecloth. 342 people were watching him. I counted them on the seating chart that morning, the way I used to count pills in the hospital pharmacy where I worked nights for 28 years. He smiled the smile of a man who has never been told no, and then he said my name like it tasted bad in his mouth, and the room went still in that particular way. Rooms go still when something cruel is about to be said out loud. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the manila folder under my chair had been waiting for him for 31 years. He just didn't recognize me yet. My name is Beatrice Halloran. I am 68 years old. I raised my daughter Sienna by myself from the night she was 3 weeks old, when her father, my husband, walked into a refinery outside Beaumont, Texas, to start his shift and never walked back out. I have told this story 100 times in my head and never once out loud, because there are some stories you save for the right room. That ballroom in Naples, Florida, on the 18th of March, was the right room. But let me back up. You can't understand what happened at that wedding without understanding the 31 years that walked in there with me. I met my husband, Reggie, in 1985, in a roadside diner in Port Arthur where I waited tables on the lunch shift. He came in covered in pipe grease, ordered a grilled cheese and a black coffee, and apologized for sitting on the vinyl seat in his work clothes. He was the only customer who ever apologized for sitting down. We were married 14 months later in a small Baptist church his uncle pastored, and I wore my mother's wedding dress with the hem let down 4 inches because she had been a shorter woman than me. Reggie worked at the Bellarose petroleum refinery as a maintenance pipe fitter. He was good at it. He could listen to a valve and tell you what was wrong with it the way a doctor listens to a heart. Sienna was born in September of 1990. Reggie cried when he held her. He was not a crier, my husband, but he cried that day, and he kept saying her name like he was learning a new word. He bought her a stuffed yellow duck from the hospital gift shop, and he tucked it in next to her in the bassinet, and that duck is still on a shelf in her old bedroom in my house. 3 weeks later, on the night of October 11, the southeast section of the Bellarose refinery had what the company report later called an anomalous pressure event. That's what they called it. 6 men died. Reggie was one of them. I was nursing Sienna in the rocking chair when the phone rang at 9:10. I remember the time because the late news had just started. The voice on the phone was a man I had never met from the company, and he was very calm, the way someone is calm when they have been told what to say. He said there had been an incident. He said they were doing everything they could. He said someone would be in touch. Someone was. The next morning, a man in a blue suit came to my front door and told me Reggie was dead. He handed me a business card. He asked me if I had a lawyer. I said no. I was 24 years old, holding a baby in one arm and a card in the other hand, and I did not know that question was a trap. Bellarose Petroleum was, at that time, owned by a company called Crestline Energy Group, which was in turn owned by a holding company in Houston, whose principal officer was a man named Donovan Mercer. I did not know any of these names that day. I just knew that a man had handed me a card and asked if I had a lawyer. Within 72 hours, a representative of Crestline came to my house with a check and a stack of papers. The check was for $86,000. The paper said that in exchange for this money, I would not sue the company, I would not speak to the press, I would not speak to investigators, and I would acknowledge that the incident had been caused by operator error. Operator error. That phrase has lived inside my chest like a splinter for 31 years. I signed. I signed because there was a baby in the next room and the rent was due, and I did not know any better, and the man in the suit kept saying it was the best thing for everyone, and my mother was on the phone telling me to take the money because there was no point in fighting a company like that. I signed, and I've been ashamed of that signature for 3 decades. But here is what nobody from Crestline knew. Reggie kept a notebook. He kept it in a glove box of his Ford Ranger, and after he died, when I cleaned out the truck to sell it because I needed the money, I found the notebook wrapped in a plastic grocery bag under the manual. It was a steno pad with a green cover, and Reggie had been writing in it for the last 7 months of his life, in small block letters, in pencil, in the careful handwriting of a man who left school in the 10th grade and was proud of every word he could spell. He had documented every safety violation he saw on the Southeast unit. He had written down dates. He had written down which supervisor he reported it to. He had written down which valves were leaking, which gauges were broken, which alarms had been disabled because they kept going off and slowing production. He had written down the name of the engineer who told him, on the 8th of October, 3 days before he died, that if he kept running his mouth, he could find work somewhere else. The name of that engineer was Donovan Mercer. I did not know what to do with the notebook. I was 24. I had signed papers I didn't understand. I had a baby. I put the notebook in a shoebox, and I put the shoebox in the back of the closet. and I told myself I would do something about it when Sienna was older, when she was safer, when I had more money. The years went by. I went back to school at 29, got my pharmacy technician certification, and started at Lake Charles Memorial. I worked the 11 to 7 shift because it paid more, and I slept while Sienna was at school. My mother lived with us the last 6 years of her life and helped raise that girl. We were not rich. We were not poor. We had a small brick house on a street with pecan trees, and Sienna had piano lessons, and at Christmas, there were enough presents under the tree that she never knew what we did not have. She grew up smart. Smarter than me, smarter than her father, smart in a way that surprised both sides of the family. She got a partial scholarship to Tulane and worked at the law library to cover the rest. She went to law school at Vanderbilt. She passed the bar in Tennessee and then in Florida, and by the time she was 31, she was a junior partner at a firm in Naples that did corporate compliance work, which is a phrase I had to ask her to explain to me twice. I never told her about the notebook. I never told her how her father really died. She knew there had been an accident. She knew I had received a settlement. She knew I did not like to talk about it, and being the kind of daughter who respects a quiet grief, she did not press. She thought her father had died in a workplace accident, the way thousands of men die in workplace accidents every year, and she was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right either, and that was on me. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself a lot of things. Sienna started dating a man named Wexford Mercer in the spring of 2024. She told me about him on the phone. She said he was an investment banker, that he was kind, that he made her laugh, that his family was from Houston originally, but lived in Florida now. She said his father had built a mid-size energy company in the 80s and sold it for a lot of money in the 90s, and now ran a private equity fund that mostly invested in oil and gas. She said his father's name was Donovan. I was standing in my kitchen in Lake Charles holding the phone, looking at the magnet on my refrigerator that said, "Home is where the hoard is," and I felt the floor tilt under me. I asked her very carefully what year his father had sold his company. She said 1998. I asked her what the company was called. She said she would have to look it up. She called me back 20 minutes later and said the company had been called Crestline Energy Group. I sat down on the kitchen floor with the phone in my hand, and I did not say anything for a long time. Sienna said, "Mom, are you there? Mom?" I said I was there. I said the connection was bad. I said I was happy for her and that I looked forward to meeting him. I hung up. I walked to the back of the closet in my bedroom. The shoebox was still there. I had moved it 3 times in 30 years and never opened it. I opened it that night. The notebook was still in the plastic bag. The pencil writing had faded a little, but Reggie's careful block letters were still there. Donovan Mercer. October 8th, 1990. He told me I could find work somewhere else. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I thought about calling Sienna right then and telling her everything. I thought about it for a long time, and then I thought about the way she had sounded on the phone, how her voice had a softness in it. I had not heard in years. She was 33. She had had 2 serious relationships that had not worked out and a job that consumed her, and she had been lonely in the way smart women in demanding careers are sometimes lonely. She loved this man. I could hear it. If I told her now, I would be asking her to carry a 30-year-old secret that wasn't hers to carry, on top of asking her to leave the man she loved. And what if I was wrong? What if Donovan Mercer had been a Crestline but had nothing to do with the Southeast unit? What if the notebook didn't prove what I thought it proved? I had never had it looked at by a lawyer. I had just kept it. So I did something I have done many times in my life, and which I am not proud of. I decided to wait. I decided to learn more first. I called a man named Curtis Yount, who had been a pharmacy customer of mine for 15 years and who, before he retired, had been an investigative reporter for the Times-Picayune. I told him I needed help with something old. I told him the bare bones. He asked me to bring everything I had to his house in Slidell. I drove out the next Saturday with the notebook and the settlement papers and a folder of yellowed clippings I had kept from the Beaumont Enterprise about the refinery incident. Curtis read the notebook in his kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold next to him. He read it twice. Then he looked at me over his reading glasses and he said, "Beatrice, this is a homicide investigation that never happened." He spent the next 8 months helping me. He had a friend who worked at OSHA in the 90s who pulled records that had been quietly archived. He had a contact at the Texas State Controller's Office who tracked the corporate paper trail of Crestline to 3 subsidiary mergers. He had a former colleague at the Wall Street Journal who knew the structure of Mercer Capital Partners inside out. We built a folder. By the time it was done, the folder was 4 inches thick. What it showed was this. Donovan Mercer had been the lead operations engineer for the Southeast Unit at Bellarose between January 1990 and December 1990. He had personally signed off on the disabling of 3 high-pressure alarms in the months leading up to the incident in order to meet production quotas set by Crestline Corporate, where his uncle was vice president of operations. After the incident, he had been quietly moved to a different subsidiary, then promoted again. The OSHA investigation had been closed in 11 months on the basis of operator error findings, and the operators in question were the dead men who could not defend themselves. The settlements with the 6 widows had been processed by the same law firm Donovan's uncle had used for personal matters for 2 decades. 3 of the widows had signed similar NDAs. 2 of them were now also dead of unrelated causes. 1 had been declared incompetent after a stroke. That left me. Curtis said the criminal statute of limitations had run out long ago. He said the NDA I had signed was, under Texas law and given what we now had documented, almost certainly unenforceable because it had been signed under duress and material misrepresentation, but proving that would take years and a great deal of money. He said the most useful thing the file could do at this point was not legal, it was reputational. Donovan Mercer was, by 2025, one of the largest private donors to energy infrastructure policy in the southeastern United States. He had a wing of a hospital named after him in Tampa. He sat on the board of a maritime museum. He had been honored by 2 governors. His fund, Mercer Capital Partners, managed something north of $3 billion, much of it from pension funds in Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, including, Curtis pointed out with a thin smile, the Louisiana State Pharmacist Retirement Trust, which was where my own pension came from. Curtis asked me what I wanted to do. I said I wanted my daughter to know who her father had been. I wanted her to know what had been taken from her. I wanted Donovan Mercer to look me in the face and know, after 31 years, that there had been a witness. But I also said I would not destroy my daughter's marriage to do it. She had picked Wexford. I had met Wexford by then, in November, when they came to Lake Charles for Thanksgiving. Wexford was a soft-spoken man, 36 years old, who taught me a card game his grandmother had taught him, and who washed the dishes without being asked, and who looked at my daughter like she had hung the moon. He was nothing like his father. I had asked him about his father once, gently, over coffee, and his answer had been one careful sentence. He said his father was a complicated man with whom he had a complicated relationship. I did not push. So Curtis and I made a plan. The wedding was set for March 18th at a resort in Naples. 342 guests. Donovan Mercer had paid for it. He had insisted. He had also insisted on giving the rehearsal dinner toast, the reception toast, and a separate welcome to the family toast during a reception itself, which a normal person would have understood was at least one toast too many. I had not protested any of this. I had let him pay. I had let him plan. I had let him assume that the small woman from Louisiana who had raised his son's wife on a hospital salary would be properly grateful for the chance to sit in his ballroom. The folder went under my chair. I had a copy with my lawyer in New Orleans, a copy with Curtis, and a copy with a journalist at Bloomberg whose direct line I had memorized. I wore a navy blue dress with 3/4 sleeves that I had bought at a department store in Lafayette for $240. I had my hair done that morning at the resort salon. I held Sienna's hand before she walked down the aisle, and I told her I loved her, and that I was proud of her, and that our father would have been proud of her too. I meant all of it. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception began at 6. The toasts began at 7:30. Donovan Mercer rose first. He thanked the guests for coming. He spoke at length about his son. He spoke at length about his son. He spoke about the importance of family and legacy and the bonds of marriage. And then he turned, with his glass in his hand, and he looked at me across the room. And he said, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the bride's mother, who has come all the way from a small town in Louisiana to be with us tonight. He said the words small town the way another man might say shoplifter. He said, I understand she worked very hard to give Sienna the opportunities that brought her to us. I understand she was a hospital pharmacy technician. He paused. He smiled at the room. He said, it is a remarkable testament to American mobility that the daughter of a woman like Beatrice could become the wife of a man like my son. The room laughed. Not all of the room, but enough of the room. The kind of laugh that is more breath than sound. The laugh of people who do not want to be impolite. I saw Sienna's face. She had gone white. Wexford was reaching for her hand under the table. I saw my future son-in-law's mouth open to say something to his father, and I shook my head at him, very slightly, and he saw me, and he closed his mouth. I stood up. I had not planned to speak. I had planned to wait until after the toasts, until I could pull Donovan Mercer aside in the hallway and hand him the folder and let him make a quiet decision about the rest of his life. That had been the plan. The plan was kind. The plan was for Sienna. But you do not say a thing like that about a woman in front of her daughter on her daughter's wedding day. You do not. I picked up the folder from under my chair, and I walked to the small staging area where the microphone was, and I asked the bandleader, very politely, if I could borrow it. He handed it to me. The room had gone quiet again, that second kind of quiet, the curious kind. I said, "Good evening. I am Beatrice Halloran. I am the bride's mother. I want to thank Mr. Mercer for that very generous welcome." I let that sit for a moment. There was some uncomfortable shifting at the head table. I said, "I would like to tell you all a story about my husband. His name was Reginald Halloran. He was a pipe fitter at the Bellarose petroleum refinery in Beaumont, Texas. He died on October 11th, 1990, in what the company called an anomalous pressure event. He was 26 years old. Our daughter was 3 weeks old. He never got to hold her on the day she went home from the hospital because he was working a double shift to pay for the crib. The room had stopped breathing. I looked at Donovan Mercer. He had not yet understood. He thought I was making a sentimental speech about loss. He had taken a small sip of his champagne. I said, "In the months before he died, my husband kept a notebook in the glove box of his truck. He kept it because he was being told to ignore safety problems on his unit. He kept it because the alarms were being shut off and the gauges were broken, and his supervisor was telling him, on the record, that if he kept reporting these things, he would lose his job. He kept it because he was a careful man, and because he wanted a record, and because he hoped, I think, that someone someday would read it." I held up the folder. I said, "This is a copy of that notebook, with his handwriting, with dates, with names. The original is in a safe in New Orleans. There is also a federal records request processed last summer of the OSHA file that was buried in 1991. There is a financial trail connecting Bellarose Petroleum, Crestline Energy Group, and Mercer Capital Partners. There is an analysis by a former federal prosecutor of a settlement agreement that I, a 24-year-old widow with a newborn baby, was pressured into signing 72 hours after my husband's death." I looked at Donovan Mercer. He had set the champagne glass down. His hand was not steady. I said, "Mr. Mercer, you were the lead operations engineer on my husband's unit in 1990. You signed the work orders that disabled the alarms. 3 days before he died, you told him he could find work somewhere else if he kept reporting safety problems. I have the memo. I have your signature. I have a witness, a man named Hollis Brennan, who was on the floor that day, and who is still alive and who has given a sworn statement. The blood was leaving Donovan Mercer's face the way water leaves a sink. He was a man, I realized, who had spent 31 years assuming that those papers in 1990 had buried the matter forever. He had built an entire empire on top of that grave. And here was the grave sitting up, in a navy dress at his son's wedding. I said, "I did not come here tonight to do this. I came here tonight to watch my daughter get married. I plan to find you afterward, in private, and hand you this folder and let you decide what to do with the rest of your life. I had planned to be a gracious mother of the bride because that is what my daughter deserves on this day. But you could not let me have that. You could not give me one evening of dignity. You stood up in front of 342 people, and you mocked the work that I did to keep my daughter alive after you killed her father." I turned to the room. I said, "A copy of this folder is going to a reporter at Bloomberg tonight. Another copy is going to the trustees of 3 public pension funds that have, collectively, $412 million invested in Mercer Capital Partners. Another copy is going to the board of the hospital in Tampa that bears Mr. Mercer's name. I would like all of you to be aware, as you sit in this room enjoying his hospitality, that the wealth in this room was paid for, in part, by the lives of 6 men, including my husband." I set the microphone down. I walked back to my table. I sat down. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that they were not shaking, and I thought, look at that. Look at what 31 years can do. I will tell you something else. As I sat down, my daughter stood up. Sienna, in her white dress, with her bouquet still on the table next to her. She walked across the room to me, and she did not look at Donovan Mercer once, and she sat down in the chair next to mine, and she took my hand. She did not say anything. She just took my hand, and Wexford, my new son-in-law, stood up at the head table, and he looked at his father for a long moment, and then he walked across the room too, and he sat down on my other side, next to his wife. Donovan Mercer's wife, a woman I had only met that morning, was crying very quietly into her napkin. I think she had known. I think wives often know. The reception did not exactly continue after that. People began, in waves, to leave. Some of them came past our table on the way out, and a few of them stopped and said something kind to me, and a few of them said something kind to Sienna, and one elderly woman whose name I never caught took my hand and said, "My brother died in a chemical plant in 1979, and I never had what you just had. I will think of you for the rest of my life." Wexford and Sienna left their own wedding reception with me. They took me back to my hotel. We sat in a suite and we ordered room service, and we ate cold chicken sandwiches in our formal clothes, and Sienna asked me, very quietly, why I had not told her. And I told her the truth. I told her I had been a young woman who signed a paper she should not have signed, and that I had been ashamed of that signature for 30 years, and that I had not known how to give her the story without giving her the shame. I told her I had been wrong to wait. I told her I was sorry. She did not say anything for a while, and then she said, "Mom, you are not the one who should be sorry." Wexford, my new son-in-law, did not say very much that night. He listened. The next morning, before I left for the airport, he came to my room and he asked if he could speak with me. He said he had known something was wrong with his father his whole life. He said he had not known what. He said he was glad, in some impossible way, to finally know what. He thanked me. He asked me if he could come visit me in Louisiana sometime soon, by himself, because there were some things he wanted to think about, and Louisiana sounded like a quiet place to think. I said yes. I said the back porch faces east, and the coffee is on at 5:30. The Bloomberg story ran 9 days later. It was longer than I expected. The pension funds began withdrawing within 48 hours. The hospital board in Tampa held an emergency session and voted unanimously to rename the wing. 2 of Donovan Mercer's largest investors filed civil suits within the month. A federal investigation was opened, not for the 1990 incident, which was beyond the statute, but for 2 other matters that the journalists turned up while they were looking at the first one. By the end of the summer, Mercer Capital Partners had filed for dissolution. Donovan Mercer himself did not go to prison. Men like him rarely do, but he lost the thing he had spent his life building, and he lost it publicly, and he lost it because of the work of a pipe fitter from Port Arthur, Texas, whose handwriting in a green steno pad outlived him by 35 years. That, I have decided, will have to be enough. Sienna and Wexford had a second wedding the following October. Just the 3 of us, and Wexford's mother, who had left Donovan in May. We did it on my back porch. Sienna wore the same dress, and we played the same song, and there were no toasts at all, which I think is the way weddings should be. My grandson was born in August of last year. They named him Reginald. He is 15 months old now. He has his grandfather's hands. I keep the yellow duck on the dresser in his room when he comes to visit, and I tell him about the man whose name he carries, and I tell him the truth. I tell him all of it, because I learned, late but not too late, that the worst thing you can do to a person you love is to make them carry a story they don't know they're carrying. The second worst thing you can do is wait too long to put it down. I am not sorry I waited until the wedding. I am sorry I waited 31 years. There is a difference. And I am old enough now to know what the difference costs, and old enough to know it was still worth paying. I have thought a great deal, in the months since that ballroom in Naples, about how a single decision in a kitchen at 24 years old can stretch its shadow across 3 decades of a life. When I signed those papers 72 hours after my husband died, I was not a coward, and I was not a fool. I was a young widow with a baby on my hip, and no one in the world to tell me what a signature could cost. But the cost came anyway. It always comes. That is the first thing I have learned, and it is the thing I would tell any young woman who finds herself sitting across a kitchen table from a man in a suit with a check in his hand. You can sign the paper. You can take the money. But you cannot pretend, afterward, that the paper did not happen. The truth waits. The truth is patient in a way that almost nothing else in this life is patient. What I have come to understand is that character is not built in the big moments. It is built in the quiet years when no one is watching, when you are working a night shift and raising a daughter and keeping a green notebook in the back of a closet because some part of you knows, even when the rest of you has forgotten, that one day you will need it. Reginald, my husband, built his character with a pencil and a steno pad on a refinery floor where his supervisor was telling him to look the other way. He did not look away. He paid for that with his life, and I have had to make peace with the fact that I cannot give him back what he gave up. What I can do is finish the sentence he started. I think now about Donovan Mercer, and I do not feel triumph. I feel something quieter than that. A man who builds a tower on a foundation of buried bodies is a man who has chosen, every single day of his life, to keep choosing the same wrong thing. That kind of choice compounds. It compounds the way interest compounds in a savings account, except in the other direction. By the time the truth arrives at his door, the debt is so large that no one payment can settle it. He did not lose his empire because of me. He lost it because of himself. 31 years earlier, and every morning since. To my grandson Reginald, who will hear this story when he is old enough, I want to say this. Be brave enough to write things down even when no one will read them. Be patient enough to wait for the right room even when your heart is breaking in the wrong one. Be honest enough with the people you love that you do not hand them a secret to carry without their knowing. And when someone tries to make you small in front of a room full of strangers, stand up. Not because revenge is sweet, because it is not. Stand up because the people who came before you, the quiet ones with their pencils and their notebooks and their long, patient lives, deserve a voice. You are their voice now. So am I. So when's your grandfather? Use it carefully. Use it anyway.